Hello again. It is, as viewers will know, an article of faith among academics and the intelligentsia in Britain and the United States that intelligence is distributed evenly across all ethnicities and that any apparent discrepancies, evidence which shows, for example, that Chinese people do better in IQ tests, say, than either white or black people, is dismissed as a product of cultural differences or educational inequality. In this way, the indisputable fact that some ethnicities do better in intelligence tests than others can be explained away and usually buried in some obscure academic journal where ordinary people never get to hear of it. Every so often, though, data comes to light which exposes this for all to see. And we can see the fraud as it really is. This happened at the end of 2020 and it related not to complicated IQ tests, but simply the aptitude test taken by people who hope to join Britain's Royal Air Force as gunners, police officers, lorry drivers and so on. Not officers, you will note, not pilots, just ordinary crew. I know that I've talked about this before, but it is so significant that I think it's worth reminding people of what came to light. For the better part of 6 months in 2020, attempts were made by means of freedom of information requests to persuade Britain's Royal Air Force to disclose the ethnicity of candidates who did well in the aptitude tests taken by those applying for admission, and also to reveal which groups had not done so well. When in December that year the figures were finally released, it was very obvious why there had been such a marked reluctance to let people see them. The tests themselves concern things like spatial awareness, the ability to manipulate three-dimensional objects mentally. You know, the sort of thing where you have to rotate shapes in your mind and work out which shape will fit where, that sort of thing. They had no connection whatever with formal education and they were not culturally biased. The scores in one, the BIS test of spatial ability, which is non-verbal, requires no ability at mathematics and is independent of whatever language is spoken. As I say, it involves rotating shapes or imagining manipulating a three-dimensional shape in space. The results of that one, taken by those who wished to be gunners, police officers and lorry drivers, were fairly typical. Over 5 years, from 2015 to 2020, this is what the scores averaged out at by people taking those tests by ethnic group. Any Chinese background, 60.1. White British, 55.4. Asian Indian, 50.1. Mixed Black Caribbean and White, 51.4. Black Caribbean, 44. Black African, 40.6. These scores align very closely with other tests, such as those for IQ, the Scholastic Aptitude Test used for admission to American universities, and many others. Chinese people, as many of us would expect, came above everybody else. This will come as no surprise. Below the Chinese came white applicants, and a little way below them were those whose families were from the Indian subcontinent. Looking at the scores for black people shows something starkly, which is that the more black heritage a candidate had, the lower the score he achieved in the test. Candidates of mixed black Caribbean background, usually one black parent and one white, came higher than black Caribbeans, who usually have some white ancestry anyway. The lowest scores of all were by those whose background was entirely black African. It need hardly be said that the Royal Air Force, from whom these scores had to be prized as though from a closely shut-up oyster, was quick to respond with an orthodox explanation. A spokesman blamed underlying inequality in education. This is, however, hardly convincing. Had the different black groups all received a different quality or standard of education from each other? Did the young people of black African heritage go to schools inferior to those which the Caribbeans had attended? It must be borne in mind that all these groups had by and large grown up and been educated in Britain. Did the Chinese and white people all attend better schools? That argument would have been more persuasive if the test had entailed a knowledge of mathematics, English grammar or general knowledge. This one didn't. All it required was an ability to think clearly and logically. Any notion that the tests could have been culturally biased in favour of Chinese and white people may also be abandoned. This might have been a reasonable point if one of the ethnic groups consisted of illiterate Kalahari Bushmen and another middle-class citizens from a sophisticated city like London, but all came from the same country. Any rational person who has not been indoctrinated into contemporary ways of thought and examined the raw data from the RAF aptitude tests without the filter of modern ideology and correctness of outlook would most probably assume that the Chinese were the brightest and most able, and the black Africans the dullest in thinking skills. That most of us veer away from this simple view of the matter in favour of mysterious underlying inequalities in education, and indeed view the obvious answer to the conundrum as being disgusting and unacceptable, tells us a great deal about the mores of the modern Western world in the first decades of the 21st century, but nothing at all about why black people do not do well in objective tests of aptitude and intelligence. I do not, you will observe, say that the obvious explanation of these scores is the correct one. For all I know to the contrary, there may be some complicated and compelling reason to dismiss these figures as no more than a statistical artefact. I'm bound to observe, though, that since they came to light a little over a year ago, nobody has come up with any sort of refutation of the idea that these figures indicate precisely what most objective people would suppose them to do. Since the Daily Telegraph obtained the figures and published them over a year ago, there has been absolute silence and no inclination for anybody to discuss the matter at all, which I find curious. In the description to this video, I give a link firstly to the piece in the Daily Telegraph about all this, and I also give a link to a site where viewers can see for themselves exactly what the tests entail. I'm quite open-minded about this and would be very willing to hear from anybody who has an alternative explanation for what the data seem on the face of them to indicate.